Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Did you know that how our brains process everyday things like faces and objects might be different if we have dyslexia? It is a question that researchers have been exploring, and today we're diving into a fascinating study that uses a cool brain imaging technique to get some answers. So, what is this study all about? Well, dyslexia is usually thought of as a reading challenge, and that is true. But some researchers wonder if there are other differences in how the brains of people with dyslexia work, especially when it comes to seeing and understanding the world around them. They focused on how quickly and automatically our brains can tell different things apart. Imagine seeing a bunch of apples and then suddenly an orange pops up. Can your brain instantly spot that difference, and does it do that just as quickly and easily if you have dyslexia? That is the kind of question they wanted to answer using a method called steady-state visual evoked potentials, or SSVEPs. Before we get into the deep details, this paper is what is called a preprint. That means it is a research paper that hasn't gone through the full peer review process yet. So think of it as a sneak peek, and while it is super interesting, it is always good to remember it is not the final word. The researchers had a clear idea here. They suspected that people with dyslexia might have a harder time with this quick, automatic seeing and sorting process. The abstract tells us they tested this with adults who have dyslexia and adults who are typical readers. They showed them streams of images, like objects, faces, and even letters, and used EEG, which is like a cap with sensors that reads brain activity, to see how their brains responded. They were particularly interested in how the brain reacted when a different image, an oddball, appeared in the stream. This oddball response, they thought, would be weaker in people with dyslexia. The introduction explains that dyslexia, while primarily a reading disorder, might also involve difficulties in higher-level visual processing. Think of it as how our brains understand complex visual information. Regions in the brain that help us read might also be involved in recognizing faces and other objects, so if these areas aren't working perfectly for reading, maybe they aren't working perfectly for other visual tasks either. They mentioned that some previous studies hinted at this, showing that people with dyslexia sometimes struggle with recognizing not just words, but also faces or even traffic signs. However, it is not always clear if these struggles are due to fundamental differences in visual processing, or if people with dyslexia just find different ways to get the job done. To figure this out, the researchers designed 3 experiments. In each one, they presented participants with a rapid stream of images, like a super-fast slideshow, at a rate of 6 images every second. This super-fast presentation is called Fast Periodic Visual Stimulation, or FPVs. Every 5th image was a little bit different, an oddball. The scientists then used EEG to measure the brain's electrical activity. They were specifically looking at the brain's response to this oddball, which they measured as a signal-to-noise ratio, or SNR. Think of SNR like how clear a radio station signal is. A higher SNR means the brain signal was strong and clear, indicating it noticed the difference. They looked at this in 3 different categories: objects, faces, and print. For the objects part, they showed images of things like apples and hats. Sometimes the oddball was a completely different type of object, like a hat appearing among apples. That is a basic level change. Other times, the oddball was a different kind of the same object, like a different shaped apple appearing among other apples. That is a subordinate level change. They expected that telling apart similar objects within the same category might be harder. For faces, they showed a stream of faces with one face identity changing periodically. They even played with attention, sometimes asking people to focus on the faces and sometimes asking them to focus on something else, like a changing color on the screen, while faces still appeared in the background. For print, they showed strings of made up letters called false fonts, and then introduced real words or pronounceable nonsense words as the oddball. This was interesting because they wanted to see if the brain reacted differently to real words compared to nonsense words, even if the participants weren't really paying direct attention to the print itself. So, what did they find? This is where things get really interesting, and not quite what they expected. In the object task, and this is a key point, they found that dyslexic readers actually showed higher brain responses, meaning higher oddball SNR. When telling apart similar objects within the same category, the subordinate level changes, this was the opposite of what they predicted. While typical readers showed a clearer difference between recognizing a new category of object versus a new example of the same category, this difference was smaller in dyslexic readers. This suggests that while their behavioral accuracy was similar, their brains might have been working harder or differently. The researchers explained this by suggesting that maybe dyslexic individuals need to recruit more brain power for tasks that others do more easily, what they call neural inefficiency. So even though they got the answer right, their brain was putting in extra effort. Now, Now, for faces, the results were even more surprising. They found that for typical readers, how well their brain detected changes in face identity was directly linked to how accurately they remembered the faces. If the brain signal was strong for detecting the change, they were better at remembering. But for dyslexic readers, this link was completely broken. Their brain's ability to detect face changes didn't predict how well they remembered the faces. This is a really important finding. It implies that even though dyslexic readers might perform similarly on the surface, the way their brain's visual system connects to later processing like memory might be different. It is like the detection signal from the eyes isn't being passed on effectively to the memory part of the brain for faces in people with dyslexia, at least not in the same way as typical readers. This might tie back to some earlier findings, suggesting that while early visual processing might be okay, later stages of recognizing and individuating faces could be affected. And here is another big one. Across all three categories, objects, faces, and print, they found that dyslexic readers had higher background brain responses or base frequency SNR. This is the brain's reaction to just seeing the rapid stream of images, not necessarily to the specific oddball changes. This suggests a general difference in how their brains process visual information. It is like their visual system is more activated or engaged by any rapid visual input, regardless of what it is. The researchers speculate this could be due to something called reduced neural adaptation. Normally, our brains get used to repetitive stimuli and their response dampens down. If this adaptation is weaker in dyslexia, it means the brain keeps firing more strongly to the incoming visual information, requiring more overall neural resources. This effect was particularly interesting in the face task, when faces were unattended. In that case, dyslexic readers showed higher base responses, suggesting they might have trouble filtering out or suppressing visual information they don't need to focus on. So, what does all this mean? The researchers concluded that, contrary to their initial predictions, dyslexic readers generally didn't show weaker discrimination signals. In fact, in some cases, like with subordinate object recognition, their brain signals were even stronger, possibly indicating more neural effort. The most striking finding is the clear difference in the brain behavior link for faces. For typical readers, a strong brain response to face changes meant good memory. For dyslexic readers, this connection was absent. This strongly suggests that even when behavioral performance looks similar, the underlying neural processes and how they contribute to behavior can be quite different in dyslexia. They also point to the elevated base frequency responses as evidence of a more general difference in visual processing, possibly related to less efficient visual encoding or a different way of engaging with visual stimuli. Now, no study is perfect. The researchers themselves point out some limitations. First, the three experiments weren't designed for direct comparison, so it is hard to say definitively how the results across categories relate. Second, their sample was highly educated. And it is possible that these adults have developed really good ways to compensate for any visual processing differences over years of practice. So, what they found might look different in children. Also, in the object recognition task, the behavioral performance was almost perfect, what scientists call at ceiling. This can make it hard to see subtle differences or correlations. Future studies might need more challenging tasks to really tease apart these subtle differences. It is important to note that in the print task, they did find some expected differences related to brain regions involved in reading, with a stronger response in the left hemisphere. However, the main group differences they observed weren't specific to print. They were more broad, appearing in object and face processing and showing up as generally higher background brain activity in dyslexic readers. This suggests that the visual processing differences aren't just about reading itself, but about how the visual system functions more generally. So, what is the big takeaway? This research suggests that while people with dyslexia might not always show obvious deficits in recognizing everyday things like faces or objects, the way their brains process that visual information and how it connects to other cognitive functions like memory is likely different. They might be using more neural resources or different strategies to achieve similar behavioral outcomes. It highlights that dyslexia is complex, and understanding these underlying neural differences even when behavior looks normal is crucial. This could open doors for better support and understanding for individuals with dyslexia, focusing not just on reading but on the broader cognitive and perceptual differences that might exist. It's a great example of how looking at the brain's signals can reveal things that aren't obvious just from watching someone perform a task. That's it for this episode of RUBIN'S Mind Lab. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more explorations into the fascinating world of psychology and neuroscience. Let me know in the comments what research you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.